Well, let me start by talking a bit about who I am. Chris Ballard, the CEO, still learning GoToWebinar software, apparently. I've held a number of titles in my life, everything from a print journalist, and most recently, before Passive House Canada, I was Ontario's Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Minister of Housing. So it's been a very exciting time moving into this realm. There are several things, though. There are several things that I have learned as I became minister and in my own work, and that is that while I'm relatively new to the world of Passive House Canada, my experience has truly convinced me that this is the way we must build and retrofit. And I will say that. I will say that in the passive house building style standards, there are no shortcuts, there's no greenwashing. Passive house construction really means healthy, resilient, and lower GHG emitting buildings. And that's something that has attracted me to the passive house standard, given my background. One of the things I wanted to bring up is this picture here of this house. There are those who say passive house standards are European, that they're very German. But really, when you look at this house demonstrates that the modern passive house standards have their roots right here in Canada. This is Saskatchewan Conservation House, built in 1977 during the oil embargo that sent oil prices skyrocketing across North America. The federal government was looking for ways to cut down on our oil usage. We used a lot of oil in those days to heat our homes. And they assigned a chap by the name of Dr. Orr, a building scientist, a physicist, I believe, to work with his colleagues to design a house that would use very little energy. This house you see was built in Regina, and it in fact did use very little energy. And when the modern day passive house scientists were looking for examples and looking to learn from some of these exceptionally near zero energy homes, they studied the Saskatchewan Conservation House. They talked to Dr. Orr, they looked at all of the extensive data that they had collected over the years. And this went into part of the modern passive house model. So those of us in Canada can take some pride that we have in our country an ancestor, if you will, of today's modern passive house standards. So today, our special guest is Maureen Sanchez. Maureen is based in Toronto, and she leads the RDH Building Sciences Passive House Consulting Services here in Eastern Ontario. She's one of the few Passive House Institute accredited building certifiers in the country, and she joined the RDH specialist team to focus on large-scale mixed-use projects. She's also supporting the City of Toronto in implementing its zero emissions building framework, and we'll learn more about that in the weeks ahead. I want to bring on a guest from Toronto to talk about their projects. Maureen teaches in the passive house community both in the UK and Canada, and that's why I'm a little bit nervous today, because Maureen actually was my instructor when I took 110, the Introduction to Passive House. So I have to be very careful that I don't slip up in front of my teacher. But before joining RDH, Maureen was a principal and building science engineer in one of the UK's pioneering passive house consulting companies. And I know Maureen has extensive expertise on the site, expertise in on-site delivery of high-performance buildings, which she demonstrated by leading site teams who were unfamiliar with passive house standards, and she led them towards certification of the building. So welcome, Maureen.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Great. So before I introduce Maureen, I just want to, for those of you who may not be terribly familiar with what a passive house is, I just want to take a couple of minutes to run down the fundamentals of what a passive house is. It's a building standard It's the most rigorous voluntary energy-based standard in the design and construction industry today. Passive house buildings consume as much as 90% less heating and cooling energy than conventional buildings. It's also a methodology. It's a way of designing buildings to achieve exceptional energy efficiency and superior thermal comfort. Heating and cooling loads are minimized through passive design, and it results in a healthy and resilient interior. So a passive house, it's not passive, and it's not just for houses. We often think it's single residences, but it's much more than that. Our name comes from the German passive house, which is a bit of a bad passive house is a bit of a bad translation from passive house. It's passive only in that the building envelope does most of the work to maintain comfortable temperatures. And this permits or allows for simpler, smaller mechanical systems. It applies to both new and existing buildings, and depending upon where you live in Canada, the retrofit, the EnerFit standards provide a proven and financially viable methodology for deep energy retrofits. So the advantages of a passive house, this chart is very simple. Super insulated building envelope, high quality windows with solar orientation, a ventilation system with heat recovery, thermal bridge free, air tightness. You feel better because of year-round stable indoor air and temperature, very quiet and comfortable throughout the changing seasons, substantial reductions in energy use and operating costs. It's very simple to use, it's very durable systems, and it gives us all priceless peace of mind. So there's my intro to what a passive house is and some of the benefits of passive house. You can learn a lot more on our website, www.passivehousecanada.com. There's extensive information about what a passive house is and what the standards are. So look forward to seeing you there. Okay, great. So I'm going to stop showing the screen, and there we are. Hi, Maureen. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you holding up?
Well, you know, other than a bit of technical glitching today, I think things are fine. But we're going to carry on nonetheless. So thank you very much for joining us here today, and I look forward to some good conversation. I'd like to start with a very simple question, though, and that's, Maureen, can you tell us why Passive House? What drew you as a professional to Passive House? You know, what do you see as its key benefits?
That's actually a good story. So how did I get into Passive House? I was studying at university. I did my second master's in sustainable buildings because that was a nice mix between architecture, engineering, and you know, making a difference towards climate change mitigation. And I had a lovely time. Everything was perfect on paper. You get a blank piece of paper, you draw your buildings, everything works. And then I got my first job. And this is where I discovered that buildings don't perform as intended, what we call that performance gap, which is more or less that difference between the amount of energy you're predicting your building is going to use and how much it actually uses in practice. And so for me, it's as if like everything I had learned was like slightly wrong. So I was pretty upset. And so I went on you know, simply a search absolutely everywhere to find how could I close that performance gap, because it's building science, it's building physics, it's not rocket science, right? So surely we figured that out. It's been a while, it hasn't changed. And this is more or less how I discovered Passive House. And you know, you dive into it and then you start learning not only that this is one of the rare standards that bridges that performance gap, but when you start learning about additional benefits, like I think for me, I've been driven by occupant comfort, probably, like understanding that we're actually making a difference to the quality of shelter that we're giving to people, as well as the very large impact that we can have on climate change mitigation. I don't know, I feel like all the people I've seen diving into Passive House, I don't see any coming out of it. So this is where I am here today, 10 years later, and nothing has changed.
Great, great. So the key benefits are helping you to deliver buildings that perform from an energy usage perspective, comfort usage, from those perspectives. It's helping you to achieve that.
Yeah.
Very good.
Exactly. I think it's that both, how to say that, I love the double standard of focusing on the occupant on one side, because I think this is important. Buildings are, everybody should, it should be a right to have, a healthy, comfortable, house to live in. And at the same time, doing everything I can for climate change, because I think if I couldn't have the impact that we can have through Passive House, I think that, my sanity would not quite stay the same as well. And so I think that double approach is like acting on a very like direct level with the occupants you're working with and working for, and then making your, making your like bringing what you can do towards climate change, I think.
Right, excellent. So, and I think that's what one of the things I found so interesting about Passive House when I started to delve into it myself was that it's much more than an energy standard. As you said, it has to do a lot with hygiene and comfort and health and resiliency. And in today's world,
Yes.
especially today's world, health, hygiene, resiliency are all key aspects of what Passive House has to offer. So it's low energy plus, I would say.
Yes.
So that's great. That's good. So tell us about your background. I'm hearing about a double master's, but what's your education path?
Oh, okay. So again, slightly unusual, I think. I started doing, so I'm French, and I did most of my education back in France, where I ended up doing engineering because I loved the teamwork and finding solutions. But my first master's was in very like general engineering, as we call it. So I did a bit of machine work, I did a bit of coding, and really didn't like it, and all kinds of things. All of this to help me focus on like or helping me discover what I was attracted to, which was the engineering part of finding a solution, the architectural part, but without knowing if I was on the artistic side, I guess, and then making a difference to climate change. And I looked around and found that, masters in sustainable buildings. So I moved to the UK to actually do that second masters in science, and yeah, and I more or less stayed there to find my first job, and I had the opportunity to work in the UK for the vast majority of my career, and yeah, it was it was fun. I did that for a while, and then it was time for a change, and Canada was starting to, like, I think the momentum that we're starting to see in high performance buildings in Canada is absolutely exciting. So yeah, I thought I could bring my energy here to help move things along a little bit faster.
So when you started your career in the UK, they were probably just about where Canada is now then, in terms of adopting Passive House standards, starting to build to those standards. Were they much further ahead?
I would say they were even not as much ahead as we already are
Oh,
right now,
right.
because like obviously Passive House started as a standard, as you mentioned, with the Saskatchewan house on a single family dwelling. Like that was the first one. And of course,
Right.
nowadays it's applicable to any type of buildings, right? You have offices, you have fire stations, you have swimming pools, like whatever you can think of, there's probably one out there. But it did start with this. And I think the UK started with that single family building. And so they were getting really good at this, which is great. But what I've seen in Canada, which I didn't see back then in the UK is that the scale from very small to very, very big. To me, it feels it has happened almost overnight in Canada. When you look at Vancouver having one single family house certified in 2015, and it's 2020, we probably have, like, Chris Higgins would probably correct me exactly, but in Vancouver, there's like, what, 5,000 or plus units. We're designing buildings both in Toronto and Vancouver that are 60-story plus. You
Right.
know, like, this is scaling big and fast.
Right, right. And it's one of the reasons that Passive House Canada is out there beating the drum, because we need to make sure we have the architects, the engineers, the building scientists, the tradespeople, all involved in the Passive House, understanding Passive House standards, taking some training, getting up to speed. To put a plug in there now, Passive House training is perhaps the most direct way to understand high performance building. Whether or not you're going to build to Passive House standards, if you know how to do it as a Passive House, you can build to any of the standards. So you're in Toronto now with RDH Building Sciences, a great company. And what exactly are you doing with them? And can you highlight a couple of the projects you're working on? I know there's one in Victoria that's really neat. I have a picture of it I was going to put up, but we had a technical glitch.
Well, maybe we can try again, but I'll explain. So yes, I moved about 2 years ago to join the Passive House team at RDH Building Science. So RDH comes from an enclosure background. It was created a little bit more than 20 years ago on the back of the Vancouver leaky condo crisis. So we have a really strong enclosure background, which, as we know, Passive House is enclosure first principle, so it has a really good tie. But so our key services really are around enclosure consulting and energy and sustainability. And RDH has been doing a lot of passive houses out west, because we do know that Vancouver is a little bit of a hotbed out there, but they didn't have people to drive this in on the Toronto side of the country. So I joined there to lead the passive house services on the east coast of Canada, and to take on bigger projects, because as much as I believe in passive house, I want to be able to change as many people's life and do as much of an impact as I can. So I think there's a nice challenge into the bigger ones. And yes, in terms of project that when I did ask to have bigger project, I got served really well, where some of the projects that have been on my plate, I think the main one you're mentioning is the University of Victoria project, where we're doing about an 800 student bed residence split into 2 buildings for the University of Victoria. So 2 buildings, 2 residential towers to house the 800 student beds, as well as 2 podiums underneath, which house like a large commercial kitchen on one side, trying to serve about like 9,000 meals a day. So by the way, side note, very tricky to make this energy efficient. And then on the other building, some teaching spaces, classrooms, and community spaces. So this has been good. And again, all that learning for the past 2 years is getting shared as well, because we've been doing many more student residences, one for UBC Okanagan, the other one actually more local, which is pretty exciting, for the University of Toronto Scarborough residents.
Oh, nice.
So a lot
Yep.
of a lot of exciting big scale projects, which I think will make a difference.
Good. Well, what are the big challenges you face in your profession and moving ahead these big scale type projects? What are some of the challenges? What advice might you have for others out there to avoid some of the issues you've bumped into before? Can you share that with us?
This is a really, really good point. Okay, let me see where I would start. I think, to be fair, just looking at where we are right now, um, I believe that we do have the technology, we do have the experience, we do have the expertise, and we're not, as I said, it's not rocket science. It's just attention to details. There's no magic. So all of this is already there. I think that the element that is probably the hardest to turn around is how we typically work on project. I think it's changing the people, like changing that idea of, no, but Maureen, we've always done this. We've done this for 30 years, and I don't see why we should change right now. Right. And so I think once,
Resistance to change is
yes.
big. Yeah, I've heard this from others. Carry on. Sorry.
No, exactly. And so I think that's probably, for me, the hardest barrier that we have to overcome, because the rest is okay. Don't get me wrong. Europe is way more spoiled than North America is in terms of availability of products and things like this. Like, things are not perfect, but they're not, like, you can still do things. Like, we can still manage. I think if we manage to change the way we work on buildings, this is probably the biggest hurdle, which will help us do it over and over again. And so what is the advice I would give? Um, exactly what you're trying to do right now. Find your community and talk to them, because you're not, except again, if you're faced with like a gigantic commercial kitchen and trying to make this as energy efficient as you can, for most people probably listening today, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've been delivering passive houses for 25 years successfully.
Mhm.
So connect to your community, and ask for advice, and surround yourself with the right team for project number one. Right? I think it's totally okay to bring people with expertise and with experience on project number one, so that we can show you how to get to the finish line in a very smooth way. Because yes, we are doing things in a different way. So there's a bit of a learning curve, but that learning curve, which is the steepest on project number one, can still be done in a very nice way,
Good.
surrounded with the right team. And once you've done that, it gets easier and easier with the next project and the next project and the next project, until, sometimes I feel really lucky where we keep working with the same people. And I have my architect that comes to me saying, Maureen, you should see, the structural engineer had thrown beams everywhere, thermal bridging everywhere. I got mad. I sent the drawing straight away. And I'm like, okay, thank you. That was easy. My job's done here.
Now
So
my job is done. And I have, as I said, I have heard from a number of people. Um, well, people embrace this idea of near zero, high performance, passive house standards. To really do it right, it starts with doing things differently. It starts with really good design, and really paying attention to detail, doesn't it? And it's why we have to make sure we have a very robust passive house community in Canada. Everything from architects, engineers, scientists, through to people who are on the job site, our electricians, our plumbers, our framers, and they need to understand the difference in how they
yeah.
used to build to how they build today.
E- Exactly. And I think it starts definitely with the design teams, but you can see that we're seeing on passive house projects a lot more design assist, where we're trying to bring a contractor early on to help
Right.
us refine the design that we're having. But it goes all the way down, because at the end of the day, as much as, the top level of your contractor might be on board, he's not the one building the project. So it needs to trickle down all the way to the trades actually making it happen. And probably as a quick anecdote here, I think that I've seen, I have had my share of, older builders saying, oh, sweetheart, we've been doing it like this for 30 years. We're not going to change. And I, I do say back, well, I'm sorry, but you're still going to have to change this one. So get cracking again. But we get friends at some point.
Yeah.
But I think the one of my most rewarding moments, I think, is I always see on every project a shift with the with the site workers around the air tightness testing. As soon as
Right.
we start doing that air tightness testing, and you can show them something very concrete about how good, like how good the job they've done, um, they're starting to understand that we might have been pestering them for good reasons, because
Right.
they're starting to see the difference. And then they're like, oh, okay, now it's starting to make sense,
Right.
especially in the middle of winter. Same thing here, conditions are not very nice. But if you have, even if it's a half finished passive house, we've already insulation and not many holes anymore, you see your workers working in t-shirts throughout the winter. Like, that's lovely. Right.
Right.
So they're starting to see the difference. And yeah, I think, like, honestly, one of the proudest moments that I've had um yeah, in my career has been on the largest multifamily project that I finished in the UK before moving to Canada, where we were doing the final air tightness test, I think over a weekend when the site was quiet, to
Right.
not bother the trades. And when the next Monday morning, I had my crane supervisor. I said, "Hey, boss, how did we do? How did we do?" And I'm like, "It's not your job." And yet you understand why we're doing this, and you care. And I was like,
Right.
okay, I've won. We've made it. We're going to be okay.
And I've heard that on a couple occasions here in Canada. I had a builder in BC tell me on the very first passive house he built, and of course he had to learn, but he had to spend as much time training up his trades folks as anything. And
Yep.
then he gave them a couple of days off so they could do the blower door test, pressurize the building, release some smoke, look for it. And he said, all of these tradespeople showed up on their day off, and I was saying, no, you're not supposed to be here today. You can go home. And they all said, no, we want to see how this works. We're proud of what we've done. We want to find
Yeah,
problem. And they spent
exactly.
the time working with the builder to look for little air leaks and talk about how to seal them and the whole bit. He was thrilled and they were thrilled. And I think it speaks to something I learned. I sat in on a trades course, one of our trades courses that we were running at Toronto's Humber College.
Yeah.
And I had a couple of framers sitting next to me, and I sort of said, "So, why are you guys here? What drove you to be here?" Thinking maybe the boss had told them they had to attend. But
Yep.
no, they were both there. They paid for the course out of their own pocket, and they were taking
Wow.
time off work to be there. Um, and uh, um, and one of them started to give me a bit of a fluffy reply, knowing who I was, and the other one just said, "We're tired of building crap. We love what Passive House has to offer, and we want to be that type of tradesperson."
Yeah.
So there is that shift, and it does seem to attract those types of folks who really want to do the best job they possibly can, and that speaks to, I think, everyone in Passive House. So um, we're getting towards the end of our time. I shouldn't be talking, Maureen, as much as I
No,
am.
it's okay.
Uh,
Can I just follow on one thing, Chris? Exactly what you
Go ahead.
said.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, one of my next piece of advice then would be, we always hear a lot of people, well, what if contractors have never done it before? Like, how can I do this? It's impossible. And it's exactly what you're saying. You do not need a contractor that has done passive house before. Not everybody has the luxury to find one, but it's
Right.
okay. What you need is a contractor. And by the way, the same applies for design teams. You want a
Yeah.
contractor that has that attention to detail and want to do a good work, like a good job. And if you
Right.
find that, then adding a layer of, hey, by the way, passive house requires A, B, and C is actually easy, but changing the actual personality that a design team person or a contractor has, where things get done fast or not quite accurately, this is like you're going to fight through the entire project. So for me, it's totally okay to have people that might not have the experience, because as long as you have one person having the experience on the team, the experience can be shared in a very easy manner if all the people at the table are
Right.
keen to make it happen and have that quality and attention to detail. That's all. It's not
That's
magic, it's not rocket science, just attention to detail.
very
That's the
good.
beauty of it.
That is the exciting part of it, is as you say, we don't all have to be rocket scientists. Thankfully,
Yeah,
we have building scientists like yourself to help us out. Very quick question that I get asked all the time, and I had our guest last week, Scott Kennedy, talk about this from a residential perspective. But in the big projects you've worked in, what
yeah.
I hear is sometimes, oh, passive house, it costs too much. Can you give us a sense of is there a premium on some of these bigger buildings to go to passive house standards, and what's the payback?
Exactly. Okay. So really good question that we cannot avoid. Um, Take it with a pinch of salt because these are only my projects and I don't have the database for every single project. But I would say that I have been working on fairly large and complicated projects.
Mhm.
And when these projects don't come on budget, the first question asked is, if we remove passive house, where do we land? I.e., is there a chance I can be back on my budget?
Right.
And most of the time, it is not passive house adding the largest premium. Like, for example, taking the University of Victoria project, um, this is a difficult project, right? Passive house, large scale. And in addition to all that, we have a very large commercial kitchen, which we need to design
Right.
in a very efficient way, which more or less, as a rough summary, means you need to move towards all electrical appliances and better kit, which means this is extra cost because these appliances are not available and, very new to the market. So a lot of extra cost. And despite all this, we've had the feedback, I think, back in October that on our Class A cost estimate, that the premium was 5% for passive house. So for me, knowing that the commercial kitchen, because of its large size and number of equipment and premium on these particular types of equipment is adding a lot, I would say that on a normal, MURB, multi-unit residential buildings, we might be at 2 or 3%. Like these are Class A cost estimates, so fairly. So this is what I'm seeing. However, again, the last pinch of salt thing is that your budget, like the cost that it's taking, it's all down to when do you start designing with passive house included into that? If you start designing with passive house in mind from day one, it will cost you a lot less than if you go for the entire design and, the day before construction, you're like, hey, Maureen, can I please have a passive house? Because no matter how much premium or not passive house is, and any other project is, if you wait for making changes that late, this is
Mhm.
extra. So everything we're saying has to be in the context of trying to design as best as we can from day one. And then you can take that cost premium, which we do agree exists, but you can really make it as small as possible.
Right. And of course, what we've learned too, then there may be that very small premium, but the payback to the owner of the building is substantially
For
that
sure.
premium returned to them very quickly through better quality buildings, smaller, more efficient mechanicals, and greatly reduced energy, as we were saying. It doesn't matter on the
Yes.
size of the building, a single family residence or 60 stories, those
Yeah,
benefits are there for all of them, right? And
exactly.
so we're hearing from governments that run social housing to purpose-built rental apartments where the builder is going to own this facility for the next 20 years. That passive house
Yeah,
standards are the way to go. May cost them a little wee bit more to build, but at the end they recoup that so quickly in energy savings and operations that that it's well worth it. So, well, listen, thank you
exactly.
very much. We've gone overboard. Don't leave us just yet. Stephanie's going to come back on the line, and we're going to open the line to or the chat room to some questions if people want to type some questions in. Stephanie, take it away.
Great. Maureen, I have a question for you. Embodied, not stored carbon is in construction materials such as concrete and foam insulation can outweigh operational carbon for many years after construction. Is the Passive House standard incorporating embodied carbon concerns?
So really good question. The quick answer is that it does not. Passive house is only a comfort and operational energy standard, right? But of course, because we do care about the planet and carbon, the community has been talking a lot about it. We've started seeing tools that can be included, like working together with the PHPP, which is a software we use for designing passive house. So we we do care about it, but passive house per se is not an embodied energy or embodied carbon standard.
Yeah.
However, the thing that I would say is that if you can fight all the fights at once, for sure, we need to do operational as well as embodied energy together. However, what we're seeing from the database right now, in terms of actual energy consumption, we are still at a stage where over the lifetime of a building, the operational energy is still way more than the embodied. So of course, when you start having passive houses and you've taken your operational energy down, then for sure, embodied will be the next fight coming up. But yeah, this will be, in the next few years, you're going to start hearing more and more about all this.
In fact,
Great.
let me jump in for a minute, Stephanie, and say that
Yep.
Passive House Canada is committed to working with the embodied carbon community. We are actively working with a couple of networks, both in the U.S. and Canada, to start addressing and designing education around that embodied carbon, because we know that as government building standards drive down operating carbon, they're going to start looking at, and really need to start looking at now. So as they drive down operational carbon, that they need to start looking at embodied carbon, and we in the Passive House Canada community need to be ready to address that challenge, and really should be addressing that challenge.
Yeah.
Great.
So small note, even if a standard doesn't require it, all the people listening online can have an impact where, for example, for us, we start directing the choice of materials in our specification, you know, and things like that. So even if a standard doesn't require it, we can have an impact with the decision and the recommendations that we're making.
Great. If you're okay to stay on the line for a couple of minutes, we have 3 other questions.
Sure, go ahead.
The first one is, can you discuss cooling in the summer?
Yes. Do I have any more details or?
Well, we can talk about how resilient our buildings are in the summer heat.
Yeah. So going back to the standard, you do have a small, but you do have an allowance for cooling, which is, again, if you're working on the on the demand throughout the year, you have a space cooling demand of no more than 15 kilowatt-hour per square meter per year. So we are allowed to have it. What we've seen is that building out west might not have used it as much, but definitely in our climate in Toronto, cooling is required. But again, rather than going straight away with active cooling, we start looking at all the passive measures through, you know, good shading, using cross ventilation during the day or purge ventilation at night, all these passive measures to reduce the amount of cooling that you need to the bare minimum. And once you've done that, then it is okay to add active cooling for that small portion. So we're seeing this happen more and more. And I think, Chris, linking on your point about resiliency, things that we've been doing more and more, again, the standard doesn't require you to understand how your building is going to perform in 50 years. However, when we build buildings, we want them to be, like, I don't know if perfect is the right word, but they need to work really well in 50 years because nobody's going to retrofit them before. You know, nobody has an extra pot of money lying around for a retrofit in like 10 or 20 years. So we do plug every building we work on through their, 20, 40, 50, 70, 80 climate files to start understanding what it looks like. And the key differences that we're seeing are definitely around cooling.
So a follow-up to the question that Alan was asking about that was, do you use windows that open in the summer?
Yes, because the only time where you might want to keep your windows completely closed in summer is potentially during that heat wave where your environment inside is cooler than what is outside. So for sure, then you keep your shading down and you keep your windows closed. But with Passive House, first, you can open windows whenever you want, by the way. And second, you have longer shoulder periods. where even if it feels a little bit warm, the air temperature outside, especially at night, is much cooler than what you have in the house. So you just open, let the heat escape, and you're good to go. So yeah, definitely like looking at operable windows to look at purge ventilation and, you know, passive measures towards cooling is definitely something we do.
Okay, and I'll give you, there's 2 more questions, we'll see how much time we have. What is the typical wall makeup of a passive house built in Toronto? That means foundation and the levels.
Sorry, what was the end of the question? Foundations and?
Foundation and the levels.
Okay, so typical. So first of all, there isn't a typical wall buildup because passive house works with absolute targets, which means they're giving you a budget for this is how much energy you can spend on heating, this is how much you can spend on cooling, this is how much you can spend in total through the PER criteria. And it's down to you. You're the chef and you can have whatever recipe you want. No ingredients is like not allowed. However, so it would work with, you know, we've seen passive houses work with prefab panels, with concrete sandwich panels, you know, timber frame assemblies, and so we've seen everything. But typically, I think, depending again on the size of your building, on the orientation, on your form factor, because a much more compact building will require less insulation, and similarly, a building with a lower window to wall ratio will need less insulation to make up for the amount of windows that we have. You could typically work with whatever backup wall you want, be it concrete, timber, steel studs, and then trying to push the insulation outwards of the structure so you have less thermal bridging. And we typically work with around 8 inches, which is a bit thicker than what we see, but nothing undoable.
Yeah,
and great. Okay, we have one last question. Sorry.
Stephanie, let me jump in for 1 second. I just wanted to emphasize what Maureen was saying is when we talk about passive house standards, we're talking about a building standard, so outcomes based, and we're talking about a methodology. And we are passive house is technically content neutral, materials neutral. Although we had the previous discussion about embodied carbon, and that's more and more playing a role. Carry on, Stephanie.
So we'll have one last question, that's it. What is your opinion on the assumption that the bigger buildings can more easily meet the 0.6 ACH standard? Should this be normalized so it is the same when doing a small house versus a large house?
Okay, that's a really good point and a really technical question. So this is completely true. The way the passive house standard has set up the requirement around air tightness is it uses air changes per hour. So we're more or less working with the volume, you know, how many times is the volume of air changed under test conditions for the air tightness testing. And this means that larger buildings are easier to achieve that target. So to palliate to that, the Passive House Institute in Darmstadt has provided a recommendation for the air permeability, which is now looking at how much leakage you have per square meter of heat loss area, right? Per square meter of enclosure. And that's a better, I think, a better way to assess air tightness. So yes, the standard is set in a way that that probably makes it a little bit easier on bigger buildings. However, I do not have the possibility to change it. This is something that PHI is discussing right now, but you can still set up an additional target on air permeability, which we are doing because that I think this is the correct way to assess how much leakage you're having, and then being able to compare apples with apples depending on the size of your building. So really good question, and please look at both your air tightness results in air changes per hour and your air permeability results with passive house typically measured in cubic meter per hour per square meter of enclosure area.
Great, thank you.
And thank everyone for your thank you everyone for your questions, and again, thank you, Maureen, for your time today. Passive House Canada is a not-for-profit organization. It's a professional organization. We got our start in British Columbia, and as Maureen has pointed out, that is the hotbed of our standard right now. But we're really growing here in Ontario as well. We were founded in 2013. We're really the advocates for the adoption of the Passive House standard through our government relations and our extensive education program, our national events, and we are the Canadian affiliate of the International Passive House Association and a member of the North American Passive House Network. Our mission is very simple. It's to make the International Passive House standard of building performance understood, achievable, adopted by government, industry, professionals, building suppliers, and consumers right across Canada. And we do this through education, advocacy, national and local events, and building projects, as I said earlier. I wanted to just bring to your attention one of the key benefits we bring to advocacy, and that is through education. If you believe in high performance buildings, if you believe that those high performance buildings are needed in Canada to meet our greenhouse gas emission targets, or simply to provide a healthier, more resilient building form, then I would encourage you to take out a Passive House membership and support our advocacy on your behalf. If you do that, you save on our excellent education programs. You can save on gaining professional development credits. And perhaps most importantly, you become part of a very passionate Passive House family. You can find help online and share best practices. You can enjoy our socials. There are job postings, and important RFPs are posted online. And you can be found a little more easily, or a lot more easily, by prospective clients or collaborators because you're in our directory. So I will make a final note as well that our national conference takes place this coming November in Victoria, BC. Come and enjoy the beautiful setting and the wonderful weather. You can find details on our website. I mentioned earlier about becoming a Passive House expert. And that requires Passive House education and certification. So I'm quite convinced that Passive House is the gold standard of the net zero high performance building certification. And you know, the most direct way to becoming a Passive House certified professional is through Passive House Canada's Pathways to Certification bundle of courses. These are perfect courses for architects, engineers, and other building professionals to take. And if you are a member of Passive House Canada, you'll receive an additional 20% off the regular price for the bundle. And for a very limited time, and given the circumstances that we're in today, we're offering folks, if they can pay 50% down now when they register, and pay the remaining 50% in about 45 days, that will be fine with us. Our goal is to educate and get certified as many Canadians in the market as we possibly can. So watch for our upcoming online course. We have the Introduction to Passive House and Overview. We have trades courses that are coming both online and with an in-shop session. Lots more you can learn at passivehousecanada.com/online courses. It's a good place to have all your questions asked and answered. And I want to thank you very much for being with us today as we enjoy our second building conversations with expert Maureen Sanchez. Thank you, Maureen, once again for being with us today. I apologize for a few technical glitches. The CEO will polish up on his webinar skills before next week, I promise. And I hope to see you next Wednesday at the same time, noon EDT, 9 a.m. Pacific time. and we'll have another exciting guest. So watch your mailbox for that announcement. Thank you all very much. Have a safe and great remainder of the week.